The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above the trauma bay, the same song they'd hummed for 3 months, and Katie Rodriguez had learned to stop hearing it. That was the point. Stop hearing, stop seeing, stop being seen. The antiseptic smell that coated everything, the walls, the equipment, her scrubs, had become invisible too, just part of the air she breathed now, clean and sterile and utterly forgettable. Denver General had become Oak Creek Memorial 3 months ago, and Katie had become no one. That was precisely what she needed. She moved through the morning shift with a kind of invisible competence that made her perfect for a place like this. The kind that slipped between the hierarchy like water through a crack. New nurses asked her questions. Senior nurses trusted her with a difficult patience. Doctors barely registered her presence. This was safety. This was survival. After Baghdad, after everything that had broken inside her and refused to reset, anonymity felt like the only honest thing left. The ER doors burst open at 7:43 a.m. The paramedics came hard, their voices overlapping in that practiced cadence that meant serious trauma. Gunshot wound, they said. Unconscious. Facial injuries extensive. No identification on scene. Katie looked up from her supply count as they wheeled through, a man in a dark jacket, his face bloated and discolored, blood matted into dark hair. His left eye was swollen shut. His jaw hung at an angle that suggested breaks in at least 2 places. The paramedic riding the stretcher was calling vitals, BP 118/74, holding steady, but we've got some concern about intracranial pressure given the facial trauma. She noted the military bearing in his shoulders even unconscious. Something in the way he was built, compact, precise, the kind of frame you only got from years of disciplined violence. She'd recognize that shape anywhere. She'd been that shape once. Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Hargrove called out, and there he was, the man who ran this place like it owed him money. Hargrove moved through the emergency department with the kind of practiced arrogance that only came from 2 decades of being the smartest man in the room. Expensive watch, expensive cologne, the kind of surgeon's hands that had never done anything outside an operating theater. He wore his authority the way other men wore colognes, it preceded him. His eyes passed over Katie without landing, the way eyes pass over furniture. The trauma team assembled. Dr. Hargrove at the head, naturally. 2 residents flanking him. The attending anesthesiologist. And Katie, moving with practiced efficiency to grab the first tray of instruments, her hands, scarred, calloused, steady, working without thought or hesitation. It took exactly 4 minutes for her to notice something the others had missed. The man's jacket pocket, torn on the right side, was leaking something. Not blood. She caught sight of it as she was prepping the instrument tray, a corner of laminated material, dark green, the edge of something official. Military ID. She felt something in her chest shift, a tectonic plate moving after months of stillness. But her hands didn't slow. Her breathing didn't change. She was good at compartmentalizing. Navy training had been excellent for that. Get me the full trauma panel, Hargrove snapped, pointing at one of the residents. His voice had that cutting quality that made people move faster. And someone get this man's information. No ID on him is administrative chaos. He turned to the nursing staff, sweeping his gaze across the room like a general surveying troops. Let's move people. He's not getting better by us standing here. Katie watched Hargrove's eyes land on her for precisely 1 second before sliding away. New staff. Temporary. Forgettable. She'd been working nights and early mornings for 3 months, which meant their paths crossed infrequently. He was still learning which nurses he could use and which he couldn't. Still deciding her worth. That decision came during the morning briefing in the surgical suite conference room. Hargrove was in full form, his voice carrying that specific timbre of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The surgical team gathered around the table, residents, attending surgeons, 2 of the senior nurses who'd been at Oak Creek long enough to have opinions. The unconscious man, still unidentified, still swollen, still stable, was being prepped for observation and facial reconstruction surgery once they ruled out internal bleeding. Fresh blood is important, Hargrove said, his tone suggesting this was obvious to anyone intelligent enough to exist in his hospital. He was looking at Katie now, his eyes carrying that specific weight of a man making a point. But fresh blood is also predictable. It quits. New nurses especially. He smiled. His teeth were very white. I'd be willing to make a small wager. How long before Ms. Rodriguez here realizes she's in over her head and moves back to wherever quiet nurses go when real medicine is happening? The room stayed carefully neutral. Senior nurses had learned not to react to Hargrove's humor, which wasn't humor at all but rather a kind of professional hazing, the way apex predators tested the boundaries of a new animal in the pride. 1 week, Hargrove continued, his voice conversational now, which made it worse. Anyone want to give me better odds? I'm thinking 5 to 7 days before she realizes that emergency medicine requires a spine she doesn't appear to have. Katie was checking the monitors. Her hands moved with a kind of precision that came from years, more years than Hargrove could possibly understand, of keeping people alive when the margins were measured in millimeters and seconds. She didn't look at him. She didn't stiffen. She didn't do any of the 1,000 small reactions that would have given him what he was hunting for, which was validation that he'd struck something. She simply took one measured breath. Then she checked the next monitor. "I'd take that bet," someone said. One of the senior residents, eager to stay on Hargrove's good side. 7 days, easy. Hargrove smiled wider, satisfied with the feeding he'd done. He moved on to the next topic, some research initiative that meant nothing to Katie, something about grant funding and donor relations and the kind of institutional power that people like Hargrove spent their entire careers building. The briefing ended. Katie gathered her clipboard and moved back toward the ward. Her shoulders were straight. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. Only when she was alone in the supply closet, reaching for fresh gloves, did she allow herself to look down at her hands. They were trembling. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of every insult she'd swallowed, every hierarchy she'd accepted, every piece of herself she'd amputated to become small enough to disappear. She pressed her palms flat against the cool metal shelf. 1 week. He'd given her 1 week before he expected her to break. She would show him what 1 week of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez actually looked like. But first, she had a patient with a severe facial fracture and no identification, a man built like a ranger, a man who'd been shot and beaten and left unconscious, and something told her that the next part of her carefully constructed anonymity was about to develop complications. She could feel it the way she'd learned to feel incoming rounds in Baghdad, not through any supernatural sense, but through the simple accumulation of experience telling her that the world was about to shift. The pair of worn combat boots sat in her locker at home, the one she'd taken from her husband's burial ceremony 17 years ago, the one she'd hidden in a closet and pretended didn't exist. They'd stayed in the dark for so long. But the way the unconscious man's shoulders sat, the military bearing that remained even in trauma, the corner of that laminated ID in his torn jacket pocket, it all suggested that the quiet life she'd built on silence and erasure was developing a fault line. Katie finished gathering supplies. She walked back toward the trauma bay with her shoulders squared and her eyes forward. Whatever was coming, she would meet it the way she'd learned to meet everything, with absolute composure and absolutely zero mercy for anything that tried to break her. Hargrove had no idea what he was actually testing. The fluorescent lights cast everything in flat white as Katie pushed her cart through the cafeteria line at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 months she'd been here. 3 months of keeping her head down, accepting assignments without comment, speaking only when spoken to. The strategy was working. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant no questions about her calloused hands or the way she moved during emergencies, like her body remembered things her mind was trying to forget. She was reaching for her tray when Dr. Hargrove appeared beside her, already in surgical scrubs, though morning rounds weren't for another hour. He was 42, maybe 43, with a kind of silver threading through his dark hair that money and good genetics provided. His watch was a Rolex, platinum band, probably $38,000, and he wore it the way he wore everything else, like it was evidence of his superiority. The surgical staff orbited him like he was the sun. Maybe he'd convinced them he was. He'd certainly convinced himself. Rodriguez, right? His voice moved through the cafeteria like diesel exhaust through a quiet street, heavy, inescapable, designed to announce its presence. The new nurse everyone's so excited about. Katie set her tray on the counter. Smiled. Said nothing. That's the thing about this hospital. He leaned against the chrome edge of the serving line, watching her with the expression of a man studying an insect. High standards. Real commitment. Not everyone makes it past the probationary period. He paused. Let his eyes move across her face like he was cataloguing weaknesses. Especially not the ones who think they're tougher than they actually are. Two other nurses stopped pretending to look at the salad bar. The cafeteria manager, a woman named Dorothy who'd been kind to Katie on her first day, suddenly became very focused on rearranging bagels. Tell you what, Hargrove continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone could hear. I'm betting you don't make it a week. Anyone want to take that action? He looked around the cafeteria. 3 residents snickered. A nursing supervisor shifted her weight, uncomfortable but silent. No takers? That's telling. Katie picked up her tray. Turned toward the exit. That's when Hargrove moved. Not violently, not even quickly. Just deliberately. He reached out, not touching her, just indicating, and her tray went with him. The ceramic plate, the coffee cup with the plastic lid, the sandwich wrapped in plastic, the small container of yogurt. All of it clattered to the tile floor in a percussion of broken crockery and spilling food. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's voice dropped to something almost conversational. Pick that up, sweetheart. Katie looked at the mess. Looked at him. Looked at the gathered staff waiting to see how she'd respond. This was the moment. Everyone knew it. Hargrove had drawn the line in institutional authority. He'd marked his territory. Now they'd see if the new nurse would break or bend. She took one measured breath. Set down her empty tray. Knelt to clean the floor. As she gathered the pieces of the broken plate, she heard Hargrove's footsteps retreat. Heard the cafeteria resume its careful normalcy. Heard Dorothy whisper something that might have been an apology. Katie worked methodically, moving from tile to tile, ensuring no fragment remained. Her hands were steady. Her breathing even. But something had shifted inside her, something that recognized what this was. Not a test of her nursing competence. A test of her willingness to be diminished. The combat boots she'd hidden in the back of her locker at home, her late husband's boots, the pair she'd kept from his funeral service because they smelled like him for almost a year, they were waiting for her, weren't they? Everything she'd tried to escape was still there, compressed into worn leather and faded laces. She'd thought Denver would be different. She'd thought if she stayed quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough, the past would stop following her. She was wrong. 2 days later, Katie found herself in morning rounds with Dr. Hargrove and the surgical team. The patient they were discussing was a 67-year-old man with severe pneumonia and a cardiac history complicated by an earlier MI. Hargrove outlined his treatment plan: aggressive fluid resuscitation, early intubation, broad-spectrum antibiotics. Katie listened. Watched. Her training, the part of her she'd buried under 3 months of deference, began cataloguing concerns. The fluid volume he was proposing, 3 liters in the first 6 hours, that was aggressive for someone with his ejection fraction. The antibiotic regimen missed a likely culprit given the infection's presentation. The intubation was reasonable, but the timing felt driven by institutional protocols rather than clinical indicators. She raised her hand. Dr. Hargrove, may I ask about the fluid resuscitation? The room contracted. Hargrove's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They narrowed. Took on the quality of something tracking movement in peripheral vision. What about it, Rodriguez? His ejection fraction is listed at 35%. She kept her voice level, respectful. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had been trained to brief officers with authority and precision. This version of herself was trying to sound like someone with 16 weeks of nursing experience. 3 liters might precipitate acute decompensation. The residents exchanged looks. One of them smiled slightly, the expression of someone watching someone else make a serious mistake. Hargrove didn't smile. Worse. He went very still. You have, he said, his voice taking on that diesel quality again, 16 weeks of nursing experience. Yes, sir. And you're suggesting that I, who have spent 15 years building the surgical protocols that have made this institution the benchmark for cardiac outcomes in the Rocky Mountain region, adjust my treatment based on your concern? Katie said nothing. Rodriguez, Hargrove continued, turning back to the patient file as if she'd already been dismissed, you'll file these charts in the central repository. I'll review your work later. He said it lightly. He said it like it was nothing. But Katie had learned to read the subtext of institutional power during her 12 years in the Navy. 12 years of watching how men with rank exercised control. Filing charts was menial work. It was a signal. It was a diminishment. It was Hargrove telling everyone in that room that he'd taken her challenge to his hierarchy and was turning it into a reason to humiliate her further. She collected the charts without comment and left to file them in the central repository on the 3rd floor. She worked carefully, precisely, checking each name, each medical record number, ensuring no errors. Attention to detail was how you survived in systems designed to crush people who made mistakes. Attention to detail was how you kept people alive. She was returning to the floor an hour later when Dr. Hargrove emerged from one of the patient rooms. He saw her. He didn't say anything at first. Just waited until she was close enough to see the calculation in his eyes. Then he took the stack of charts from his own hands, files she'd just completed, and dropped them to the floor. The sound was different this time. Heavier. More deliberate. Paper scattered across the tile in a fan pattern. Not one file. 6 files. 6 patients' entire medical histories, spread across the floor like he was making a statement about her competence, her presence, her right to exist in his hospital. Filing errors. He said it to the 2 residents standing behind him, speaking about her like she wasn't there. This is what happens when we hire nurses on the basis of needing bodies instead of needing competence. Katie knelt to gather the files. Her hands moved with precision. Around her, the floor continued its routine. A phlebotomist passed with a specimen cart. A transport worker wheeled a patient toward radiology. No one stopped. No one helped. No one acknowledged what had just happened except Hargrove, who watched her collect the papers with the satisfaction of a man who'd just confirmed something he already believed about the natural order of things. As she gathered the last file, her fingers brushed against a jacket that had been placed on a nearby chair. The unconscious Army Ranger had been moved to a recovery room pending identification of his family. His personal effects had been bagged and stored in his room, but his jacket, heavy canvas, the kind that soldiers wore, had been brought to the nurse's station for processing. Her hand was already moving back when she felt the weight. The shape. Something rectangular pressed against the fabric in the inside pocket. Without thinking about what she was doing, without allowing the more cautious part of her brain to object, Katie reached into the jacket and withdrew a military ID. The photo showed a younger version of the man. Darker hair. A slight smile. The kind of smile that came from someone who didn't know yet that smiling would become difficult. Captain Marcus Chen. The room tilted slightly. Not physically. The floor stayed level. The light stayed the same shade of white. But the geography of Katie's life, the careful separation she'd maintained between her past and her present, shifted at a fundamental level. Marcus Chen. Her son's commanding officer during the deployment to Baghdad. The man who'd written her the letter. The letter she'd read exactly 17 times. The letter she kept in a sealed envelope in the bottom of a kitchen drawer beneath the box of tea she never drank. She'd read those words over and over, trying to find the subtext, the thing Marcus Chen wasn't saying. Had her boy been afraid? Had he called out? Had he understood what was happening in those final seconds, or had mercy rendered him unconscious first? And now Marcus Chen was lying unconscious in a recovery room at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver, 1,200 miles from his base, his face bruised beyond recognition, his military ID secured against his chest like armor that hadn't been enough. Katie slipped the ID back into the jacket pocket. Placed the papers on the chair. Stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Dr. Hargrove was watching her from across the floor. He'd noted the moment her attention shifted. The moment she'd touched the jacket. The moment something in her expression changed, not much, just enough for someone trained to recognize such things. For a second, maybe less, their eyes met. Then Katie looked away. But that wasn't the worst part. The heart monitor began its descent at 2:06 a.m. Katie was 2 floors up, restocking the supply closet on the 4th floor surgical wing, when the code alert crackled across the overhead system. Code blue, ICU Bay 7. Code blue, ICU Bay 7. She didn't move immediately. 3 months at Oak Creek Memorial had trained her to let the attending physicians respond first, to stay invisible, to fold herself smaller with each shift. But something in her chest tightened. Bay 7. That was Captain Chen's room. She was downstairs in 40 seconds. Not running, that would draw attention, but moving with the kind of purposeful speed that came from muscle memory she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The ICU entrance was controlled chaos. A resident she recognized, Dr. Patterson, stood frozen beside the monitor, his hands at his sides. The night nurse, Carla, was already pushing epinephrine into the fall line, but her movements were mechanical, uncertain. Captain Marcus Chen lay motionless on the bed, his chest barely rising. The monitor showed a rhythm that made Katie's blood move like ice water through her veins, tamponade. The pericardial sac around his heart was filling with fluid. Every beat was working against itself. "Where's Hargrove?" she heard herself ask. Her voice came out steady, but it didn't sound like her voice anymore. It sounded like someone else entirely. Carla glanced at her. He said not to call unless it was a true emergency. Katie looked at the monitor. The oxygen saturation was already dropping. 68% and falling. The systolic pressure had collapsed to a whisper, 62 millimeters of mercury. This was true emergency, and Hargrove was unreachable, or worse, unreachable by design. He'd been looking for a reason to move against her since day one. A failed crisis on his watch while he was unavailable? That would be perfect for him. Negligence on the night shift. Negligence from the new nurse who had the audacity to question his protocols. Katie's hands were already moving. She grabbed the crash cart, her fingers finding the equipment with the automatic precision of someone who had done this in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of a firefight. 14-gauge angiocath needle. 20 milliliter syringe. She was already positioning herself at Chen's bedside, her hand moving to his chest wall, finding the landmarks with her eyes closed. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The skin was clammy, the pulse weak and thready, the man's body signaling the same message the monitor was screaming, time was running out. "What are you doing?" Patterson's voice came from somewhere behind her, but it sounded far away now. Everything did. The hospital noise faded into a tunnel. All she could hear was the monitor, the ventilator, the hiss of the 4-pump. Her breathing. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned to take when mortar rounds were incoming, when her hands had to be steady or people died. "Pericardiocentesis," she said. "He's in tamponade. We have maybe 2 minutes before his blood pressure stops registering." You can't, we need to call." Katie didn't answer. She was already prepping the skin, her muscle memory flooding back like a door opening to a hallway she'd sealed off 1,000 times. Baghdad. FOB Shank. 2015, a private first class named Jerome Atwood with a chest wound that had filled with blood, and Katie, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez then, with a rank that meant something in a place where medicine was the only language that mattered, had done exactly this. The needle went in. The syringe drew back. 50 milliliters of blood poured into that chamber, released the pressure, let the heart beat freely again. The monitor showed immediate change. O2 sat climbing. 72%. 78. 84. 90%. The rhythm stabilized. Sinus rhythm. Strong sinus rhythm. Chen's blood pressure crept upward, a number appearing on the screen like a signal from a disappearing person, 84/56. Still low, but alive. Salvageable. The hiss of air escaping as she withdrew the needle sounded like the first breath after drowning. Carla was staring at her. Patterson was staring at her. They exchanged a look Katie had seen 100 times in 100 different uniforms, a look that meant questions were forming. Questions about who performed emergency procedures with that kind of precision. Questions about hands that moved through a life-saving technique like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Questions about a nurse who didn't second-guess, didn't hesitate, didn't need permission. "Get him a chest X-ray," Katie said, her voice still coming from somewhere else, somewhere that remembered commands. "And 2 units of ONEG. His hematocrit's probably critical." She stepped back from the bed, and only then did she notice her hands. They were shaking slightly. But not from fear. From restraint. The kind of shaking that happened when adrenaline had nowhere to go because the emergency was over and the normal world was trying to reassert itself. What was, Patterson was still trying to form a sentence. Katie turned away. "I'm going on break," she said quietly. The words came out cold and casual, the kind of thing a tired nurse might say at 3 in the morning when the crisis was past. But it wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a statement. It was a command disguised as something ordinary, and in the silence that followed, only Carla seemed to notice the transformation. The careful, deferential nurse who asked permission to use the bathroom had been replaced by something else entirely. Someone who had ordered the ICU around like they commanded squadrons. By the time Katie reached the break room, her phone was buzzing. A text from Dr. Hargrove's office, incident report filed unauthorized procedures ICU Bay 7. Report to my office at 6 a.m. She stared at the message. He'd already activated his network. He'd probably received a notification the moment the pericardiocentesis was performed, not because he cared about Chen's outcome, but because he'd been waiting for something like this. A procedural violation. A new nurse overstepping. Institutional authority was his power source, and Katie had just given him the weapon he needed. She sat in the darkness of the break room, listening to the hospital breathe around her. Ventilators. Monitors. The soft beeping of 1,000 machines keeping 1,000 people alive. Her combat boots, the worn pair she'd buried in the bottom of her locker 18 months ago, suddenly felt heavier than they should. Because the worst part wasn't what she'd done. The worst part was that she'd saved Captain Chen, her son's commanding officer, the man who'd witnessed the worst moment of her life and written it down in formal military language and sent it to her as if it was his job to deliver her grief in a way the army could understand. And now she'd revealed herself to do it. But that wasn't even the worst part. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had already begun the next phase. The calls were already being made. Board members she'd never heard of were receiving updates about her reckless behavior and clear pattern of protocol violations. Investigators from the hospital's legal department were being contacted. References from her sparse employment history were being quietly contacted. And somewhere in the machinery of Oak Creek Memorial's institutional power structure, a termination procedure was already being set in motion. The only question was how quickly he could move before anyone figured out that Captain Chen, the man she'd just saved, might have some very interesting things to say about the quality of her medical skills. The monitor's glow from the nurse's station reflected off the break room window like a distant lighthouse. 64 heartbeats per minute. Steady. Strong. Alive. And Katie sat alone in the dark, understanding for the first time that saving a life was sometimes the exact moment everything got worse. By 6:11 a.m., Dr. Hargrove was already on the phone. The hospital administrator's office had a view of the Denver skyline, but Hargrove kept his eyes on his laptop screen, watching the call logs populate. 3 board members on speed dial. Each one a donor. Each one a lever. He'd spent 15 years building this apparatus, the research wing bearing his name, the quarterly galas where wealthy patrons pledged 6-figure commitments, the whispered conversations at country clubs where his name meant something. And now a 3-month nurse with no credentials and a hero complex was dismantling it piece by piece. The call to Margaret Sterling went first. Margaret. About that new cardiac nurse, the one who's been making noise about my protocols. She performed an unauthorized emergency procedure last night. Cardiac tamponade. Pericardiocentesis. Circumvented the entire chain of command. His voice was honey over broken glass. I'm convening a review panel. Just wanted you to know before the paperwork hits. Margaret's response was exactly what he expected: concern, loyalty, a promise to be present for the disciplinary hearing. By 8:13 a.m., 2 more board members had been called. By 9:22 a.m., Hargrove had submitted formal complaints to the chief nursing officer about Katie's pattern of insubordination and unauthorized independent medical decisions. He'd contacted 3 references from Katie's sparse previous employment history, all of whom, mysteriously, had guarded responses. One said she didn't stay long at her last position. Another said he couldn't comment. The machinery was grinding, and it was grinding fast. By 10:38 a.m., an emergency review panel had been scheduled for noon. 3 hospital board donors. Hargrove presiding. No military background among them. No understanding of what a life saved at 2 a.m. actually meant. Katie knew something was wrong when the chief nursing officer pulled her aside at 10:51 a.m. Janet Kowalski had worked at Oak Creek for 11 years. She looked at Katie with something between pity and dread. There's going to be a hearing. Noon. Administrative review. Dr. Hargrove has filed complaints. You need to understand, unauthorized procedures are serious. Even if the patient survives. Especially if the patient survives. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She simply nodded and said, I understand. But she did understand. She understood the machinery. She'd seen it operate before, in different uniforms, different buildings, but the same fundamental truth: institutions protect themselves before they protect anything else. The patient could live or die. What mattered was whether the hierarchy held. The hearing lasted 43 minutes. Hargrove presented his case with surgical precision, a presentation on his laptop showing hospital protocols for emergency procedures. Board member Sterling asked questions that felt more like accusations. Did you have permission? No. Did you notify the attending physician? There was no time. Do you understand that this hospital has procedures for a reason? Katie sat across from them at a conference table, her hands folded. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself with passion or desperation. When asked to explain her actions, she said only, the patient was dying. The resident froze. Someone had to act. She said it like it was the simplest truth in the world. Like duty was a fact, not a debate. By 12:34 p.m., Dr. Hargrove delivered the termination. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for protocol violations and insubordination. Security will escort you from the building. This is not a request. It was a command. He said it like a man who believed his own authority was infinite. Katie stood, unbuckled her badge from her scrubs, and set it on the table. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She simply said, Captain Chen deserves better care than your ego can provide. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Hargrove's face flushed. His hand opened and closed. She'd done something worse than disobey him. She'd revealed that she saw through him. That his power, his title, his network of donors and favors, was all just theater masking a fundamental emptiness. She cleared her locker in 9 minutes. her shift shoes, a half-empty coffee tumbler, some protein bars, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the pair of worn combat boots. Black leather, cracked at the seams, the sole scuffed from 1,000 miles of concrete and sand. She'd kept them for 17 years. They belonged to her husband, James Rodriguez, Army Ranger, dead 12 years. She'd worn them to his funeral. After that, they went into a storage box in her garage, then a closet, then finally the bottom of her locker at Oak Creek. A secret kept next to her stethoscope. Security walked her to the parking garage. She didn't look back. By 6:13 p.m., Katie was standing at Riverside Cemetery in the rain. The real rain now, not the metaphorical kind that exists in songs. Rain that soaked through her civilian clothes, rain that made the earth soft and hungry. James's grave was in Section D, Row 7. The stone read his name and dates and nothing else. No epitaph. No poetry. She'd come here maybe twice a year since the funeral, never staying long enough for the rain to find her skin. But tonight she came with the boots. She knelt in the mud and pulled them from the bag. The leather was cold. She held them like they were still carrying weight. "I saved him," she said aloud. "The man who wrote about Michael. Captain Marcus Chen. He crashed and everyone froze and I was the only one who could do anything. So I did." Her voice cracked on the last word. "And now I've lost everything. Again." Hargrove knew. He's known the whole time that I challenge him, that I see through his protocols, his posturing, his need to be superior. So he used what he had, his board, his power, his institutional machine. And I let him. I let him because I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to be nobody. The rain hammered against her shoulders. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. That was what she'd been taught. What she'd believed. What she'd tried to become by abandoning her rank, her unit, her entire identity and walking into a quiet hospital in Denver where no one knew that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had ever existed. She stood with the boot sinking into the mud beside James's headstone. "I failed you. I failed Michael. I failed the uniform. I failed Captain Chen. I failed everyone." She held the boots like they could anchor her to something real. The mud pulled at her feet. The rain felt like punishment. She'd carried the secret for so long, the PTSD that wouldn't break, the nightmares where Baghdad streets turned into hospital corridors, the way her hands moved on their own in crisis because muscle memory was the only thing stronger than trauma. She'd thought hiding was healing. She'd thought anonymity was safety. She'd thought that by refusing to be a warrior anymore, she could become something else. Something quiet. Something that didn't hurt people. But she'd hurt James anyway. And Michael. And herself most of all. The rain fell harder. She thought about throwing the boots into the river that ran past the cemetery. Thought about walking away from them the way she'd walked away from everything else. Her career. Her identity. Her son's memories of her as anything other than the woman who wasn't there when he needed her most. She opened her hands. The boots felt heavier than they should. Cold and wet and real. She closed her eyes. And then she heard it. Faint at first, so faint she thought the rain was playing tricks. A distant sound cutting through the storm. Not a siren. Not a car. Something else. Rotors. Helicopter blades cutting through the sky like a heartbeat returning. She opened her eyes. The rain continued. The cemetery remained silent except for that growing sound, that rhythmic thunder approaching from somewhere over the Denver skyline. She stood there holding her dead husband's boots, understanding with sudden clarity that her lowest moment and her rescue had arrived in the same breath. And she had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. No idea that by 8:22 p.m., 3 Black Hawk helicopters would be landing in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial. No idea that Captain Marcus Chen, still wearing a hospital gown, had woken up asking for her name. No idea that his commanding officer had already been contacted. No idea that the entire apparatus of military bureaucracy, the one she'd spent 17 years running from, was now moving toward her with the inevitability of fate. The rotor sound grew louder. Katie stood in the rain with the boots in her hands, and somewhere in the distance, the rescue she never asked for was coming to find her. Security reached Katie at 6:41 a.m., their hands gentle but final. Her ID badge clattered into a manila envelope. The words echoed like a sentence being read, effective immediately, protocol violations, hospital liability. She walked through the automatic doors into Denver's cool morning, the weight of invisibility finally lifting because there was nothing left to hide. That's when the lobby doors exploded open. Her son Marcus burst through, 17 years old and furious, carrying the shadow box she'd hidden in the basement 3 years ago. The one she'd sealed shut and buried under winter coats. His arms trembled as he held it forward, and every person in the lobby stopped moving. Security froze. The receptionist's fingers went still on her keyboard. Even the morning light seemed to pause. "This is my mom," Marcus said, his voice cracking but steady. "Everyone needs to see this. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, United States Navy SEAL." The lobby went breathless. A trembling HR nurse, the same woman who'd processed Katie's termination papers at midnight, who'd been ordered to have them ready before dawn, opened her personnel file with shaking hands. She read aloud, "Citation for the Silver Star." She stopped. Looked up. Then continued, "For extraordinary heroism under fire during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Fallujah, 2007. Captain Marcus Chen wheeled himself forward from the elevator, moving with the precision of someone who'd relearned how to live in his own body. His eyes found Katie's and held steady. He began naming her decorations like a man reciting scripture, 2 Purple Hearts. He waited. Navy Cross. Another pause, heavier. Distinguished Service Medal for the Fallujah extraction that saved 16 Rangers, including the colonel who now runs JSOC. The silence didn't break. It multiplied. 2 FBI agents stepped from the stairwell, their windbreakers marked with gold letters. Their boots struck tile in perfect rhythm, tap, 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 echoing through the atrium. The lead agent, a woman with steel-gray eyes and 14 years of federal investigations written into the lines of her face, stepped directly into Dr. Hargrove's path as he emerged from his office. "Dr. Richard Hargrove," she said. "We've been investigating your research grant fraud for 2 months. We've also recovered evidence that you attempted to forge Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez's termination records to cover your retaliation against a protected veteran. That's a federal crime. You're under arrest." The handcuffs appeared with a soft click. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "This is a misunderstanding. The records are, the hospital policy clearly states," his voice kept rising, higher, more desperate. "You don't understand the complexity of medical administration. She performed an unauthorized procedure. The liability alone." "Save it," the agent said flatly. She walked him past the nurse's station, past the board members who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, past the residents who'd watched him command them for 15 years. Every person in the hospital watched in complete silence. Hargrove's voice became a whimper, "This isn't how this ends. This isn't, I have connections." "I have?" The elevator doors closed on his words. Katie didn't move. Her son came to her side, the shadow box still in his arms. Captain Chen rolled his wheelchair close enough that she could see the bandage beneath his hospital gown, could count the stitches holding him together. The HR nurse was still holding Katie's personnel file, unable to move, unable to process that the woman she'd fired had 6 federal medals and a Navy Cross. One of the board members, a man who'd approved Hargrove's budget for a private research wing while denying Katie's raise request, stepped forward. His hands were shaking. "Senior Chief Rodriguez, we had no idea. The hospital would like to offer you the position of Director of Trauma Services." Full reinstatement. Whatever salary. Katie held up one hand. I'll take a different offer. Veteran Services Program. New wing. Pro bono trauma care for anyone wearing a uniform. That's my condition. Of course. Yes. Absolutely. 6 months later, Katie stood in her office at Oak Creek Memorial, wearing scrubs, not a suit, not a title that required a corner office. She wanted scrubs. She wanted vitals to check and hands to hold and the precise clarity of a person doing what they were meant to do. The combat boots sat on her shelf next to a framed photograph, Captain Chen, now mobile and standing, pinning her reinstatement badge to her chest. The military ID, the object that had started everything, the small plastic proof of Marcus Chen's rank that had led her to the truth, remained tucked in the frame's corner like a bookmark in her second life. The door opened. One of her nurses, a kid named Devon who'd been terrified of her on day one, knocked softly. "Senior Chief? We've got 3 incoming from the VA. One's a spinal cord injury, one's complications from an amputation, one's..." "Bring them to Trauma 3, Katie said. She was already moving, already pulling up the files, already becoming the thing she'd been trained to become. "Get me 2 units of ONEG, trauma setup, and call ortho." "Yes." She didn't need the title anymore. She didn't need the recognition. The board members who'd fired her were gone, some retired quietly, some shuffled to lesser positions. Hargrove was selling liability insurance from a folding table in a strip mall on the edge of Denver, his name tag reading Steve, flinching whenever anyone called him doctor. The insurance company had moved him to their lowest-paying office after discovering his entire career had been built on intimidation rather than innovation. Katie checked the 4 sites on her first patient, her hands moving with the precision that came from a decade of field medicine, from holding soldiers' hands while they stopped breathing, from knowing exactly when to push and when to wait. The trembling in her chest, it wasn't fear anymore. It was restraint. The choice to stay here, in scrubs, in the quiet heroism of keeping people alive when they had no one else. Her son came by that evening, bringing dinner. They sat together in her office without talking much, the way soldiers do. He touched the combat boots once, gently. His father's boots. The man he'd never met but understood through Katie's silence, through the way she moved with purpose, through the military bearing that had nothing to do with rank. "You did good, Mom," he said finally. Katie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the 3rd Battalion insignia on his own uniform. Her son was following her into service. Not because she'd pushed him. Because he'd watched her sacrifice everything for it and wanted to understand why. Because authenticity speaks louder than any title ever could. "My fight is here now," Katie said quietly. She gestured toward the window, toward the city below, toward the people who would come through those doors broken and terrified and need someone who'd already survived the worst. "But your fight, wherever it takes you, that's yours to own." He nodded. Understood. The quiet person in the room had turned out to be the most dangerous one all along, not because she carried weapons or gave orders, but because she'd chosen to heal instead. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. What would you do if you discovered your coworker was someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight? Have you ever underestimated someone who quietly outranked everyone in the room? Subscribe and comment below. Let us know your thoughts on Katie's story.